Well, I just want to get a feel for what type of Aggies we have in the room. So I just want you to think about who you are as an Aggie. Are you more of a 2%er, or are you more, and be careful, listen to the word right now because we've got kids in the room, but are you more red axe, like something that you chop a tree with? Like that's what we're going to use tonight. Are you more of a 2%er, more red axe, or somewhere in the middle, okay? Let me just give you some specifics. So here's how it's gonna work. If you're more of a 2%er on something in particular, I just want you to raise your hand like this, because you're gonna 2% the exercise. Like you just slip up just one finger. This is the 2% mode. But if you're red axe about something, you just put both arms up because you're all in. And if you're somewhere in between, you just throw up one hand, okay? So let me just ask you, let's just get really specific with Aggies in the room tonight. Like when people bang out the hullabaloo cadence on the escalators at Kyle Field, what are you? How do you respond? What's your whoop like in that moment? Okay, that's great, thanks. What about this? When it comes to not stepping on the seal, what are you? Okay. All right, thanks for honesty, that's great. When it comes to pulling tickets, where do you fall? Yeah, that's great. Good. How about this? When it comes to your sports pass, okay, like 2%ing means that you sell it often. Red axe, you max that sucker out. Somewhere in between, you make it to the football games, but not really anything else. Okay, great. What about this? If you're a freshman in here, you'll have to think about next year, but how long does it take you, or did it take you, to finish your sophomore Wildcat? Like 2% is you finished first because you never really started, and red axe, you made it sure that you were the last one to finish. Where are you at on that? Sophomores, let's just hear you. We literally don't have one sophomore in the room tonight. There you are. Okay. It's great. What about this? When it comes to classes on Zoom, where are you at with that? That's what I thought. Okay, that's great. That's great. Hey, Jesus can redeem Zoom too, so he can use it. He uses all things. Anyway, I don't know if that's true, but anyway, hey, I appreciate your honesty, and it's just, I want to put this idea in your mind. I'm thankful that the Aggie community has this type of lingo that just helps us get our minds around what type of Aggies we are. Are we 2%ers? Are we those who are kind of red axe about things? Or do we just kind of somewhere in the middle? And as you kind of think about that, when you categorize yourself as an Aggie, I want you to think about it now in terms of being a follower of Jesus Christ. Just right where you're at right now, at this point in the semester, you don't have to hold up your hand or anything like that. But when it comes to you following Jesus, where would you kind of categorize yourself? Are you in a place where you're kind of 2%ing your relationship with Him? Would you say that you're kind of white hot right now? You are all in with Him? Or maybe you're just kind of somewhere in the middle. Like, I want to be very clear with you. The reason Breakaway exists is that we want you to be white hot for Jesus. Like, we're not here to just be like better people or more religious people. Like, I want you to know our aim is not just that Jesus would be a part of your life. Our aim is that Jesus would be the passion of your life. That you would know Him and that your life would encounter His life in such a way that you realize Him not just as your Savior, but as your King and as your provider of all life, that He would be that the greatest joy that you could ever know would be knowing Jesus Christ. Like, we want to help cultivate you into followers of Jesus that are all in with Him. And it's important for us to talk about it, especially at this time of year, because spring fever is set in. I mean, the weather the last few days, today was okay, but the last few days has been incredible. And man, when the weather turns like that, it just becomes harder to execute. And we're in the middle of a pandemic, hopefully towards the end of it. But I don't know if you feel that with your schoolwork, you're just done with it. It's like I just can't do it. or even with your organizations you're involved with, your commitments, the gears are just kind of grinding. You don't have the fire behind your yes that was there in January. That's not the same fire behind your yes to that organization now. Spring fever is set in, and if we're not careful, that spring fever can bleed into our spiritual lives, and we can find ourselves just kind of existing or coasting with Jesus, where Jesus is a part of our life. Like, yeah, he's there. Yeah, I made it to Breakaway tonight. Yeah, I went to church on Sunday. Yeah, I've read my Bible some. You know what? I prayed when I needed to. He's a part of your life, but he's not the passion of your life. And so tonight, as we look back into the life of David, I hope that you've enjoyed journeying through the life of David. It has been so refreshing to my soul to sit in a character of the Bible for an extended period of time, especially someone who was labeled by God as the man after God's own heart. That's the type of man I want to be. That's the type of woman that I want you to be. That's my hope for my kids, that we would be men, that my wife would be a woman that is after God's heart. That's my desire for every single one of you, is to know that life, that when people look at you, they would look at you and say, that person knows Jesus. That person meets with Jesus. That person doesn't just know Jesus as a part of his life. Jesus is the passion of his life. And as we look back at the life of David, David is going to show us what it looks like to be all in with God. To not 2% things, but to be white hot for him. So if you have a Bible, turn with me tonight to 2 Samuel chapter 6. 2 Samuel chapter 6 is where we're going to be. And as we look back at the life of David, I'm going to give you 4 steps that you can take to move from 2%ing or from being somewhere in the middle to being white hot, all in for Jesus Christ. If this is your first time here, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page of where we're stepping into the life of David. David's the second ever king of the nation of Israel. If you were here with us last week, we saw David, after 15 years, finally take the throne, finally becomes king. And so here he is, he's finally the king of the nation of Israel. And what we are seeing, this chapter is early on in his reign. And what we're seeing is what David prioritizes as king. We saw it last week, that he prioritized unity in the country. We saw him establish a new city as the capital because the country was fragmented. Like, there was a group of people here that were ruled by one person. There was a group of people here ruled by David. And David said, you know what? We're all coming together. We got a new capital. We're going to be a unified country. Not only that, we saw that David prioritized full submission to God. We see him going to battle against Israel's greatest enemy. And what is David doing? He's asking God every step of the way, what would you have me do? That's where we find ourselves. We find ourselves in the story early on in David's reign, discerning what he prioritizes. Read with me 2 Samuel chapter 6. I'm going to read you verses 1 through 11. It says this: David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baale, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. They carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. And David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error. And he died there beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. The first thing that we see David doing, and the first step that you can take if you want to be all in with Jesus, is this: prioritize God's presence. Prioritize God's presence. Again, I'm going to give you 4 things tonight. I hope you're taking notes. Don't ever assume that God doesn't want to say something to you that you don't need to write down. When the God of the universe speaks, you write. That's the way it works. The first thing you can do is prioritize God's presence. The reason that I say that is because this is a story about David moving the ark of the covenant, okay? I wouldn't be surprised if the majority in here have no clue what I'm talking about when I say the Ark of the Covenant, especially if you're new to the Bible. The only time that you might have heard the word ark in reference to the Bible is Noah's Ark. We're not talking about a boat here. What you need to know is the Ark of the Covenant was the most valuable and precious and sacred piece of furniture in the entire kingdom of Israel. It was a box that was about 4 feet by 2.5 feet. It was made of wood. It was covered inside and out with gold. Inside of the box were 3 things: 2 stone tablets on which were the 10 Commandments, a bowl of manna, which is the food that God sustained the Israelites with when they came out of Egypt and wandered in the desert, and then Aaron's staff. On top of the box was a gold slab with 2 cherubs, which were angelic beings who had their wings stretched out over the box toward one another, and the top of the box was known as the mercy seat. And it was said that the presence of God resided right there over the box in between the 2 angelic beings. So the Ark of the Covenant, when the nation of Israel came out of Egypt, God told Moses to erect a tabernacle. It was basically the meeting place of God. And inside the tabernacle, there was a room known as the Holy of Holies, and it was separated from the rest of the tabernacle by a very thick curtain. And inside that place known as the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. And that room was so special because that is where the presence of the Lord was said to reside. And a priest, only one person, was able to enter that the Holy of Holies, 1 time a year to make atonement for the sins of the nation of Israel. I go to all that explanation for you to know the Ark of the Covenant is synonymous with the presence of God. Let me give you an example. Like Numbers 10:33, it says this. This is talking about the nation of Israel. It says, "So they set out from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey." Watch this. "In the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord went before them 3 days' journey to seek out a resting place for them." So anthropomorphic language is giving to a wooden box. And it's saying that this box went before the nation of Israel to find a place of rest for them. Why? Because the Ark of the Covenant was synonymous with the presence of God. So just take all of that into account. David is going and tracking the Ark of the Covenant down. He is bringing it into the capital city. Why? Because he prioritizes the presence of God. Prioritizes the presence of God. Now you need to understand what's been going on in the nation of Israel prior to David ruling. Saul, his predecessor, didn't prioritize the presence of God. This is what 1 Chronicles 13:3 says. This is David talking. It's in a different account of the same story. David says, "Then let us bring again the ark of God to us, for we did not seek it in the days of Saul." Saul had reigned over Israel for 20 years, and David's saying, look, hey, we got to get back to what is right. We need to bring the Ark of the Covenant back into our midst, because for the last 20 years, we didn't seek it. So Israel was a nation under God that wasn't seeking God. I wonder how much of that is true of the Christian bubble here at A&M. That there are people that are kind of under the bubble of God that are not seeking God. So this is very fitting for us right now. Saul in the nation of Israel had been 2%ing God, and David is saying, no, we're going to get white hot for him. We're going to be all in with his presence. We're going to prioritize the presence of God. Let me just ask you, can you think back in your life and can you just remember a time in your life where you are just confident without a doubt, you know what, God was there? Like, can you think back to a conference or mission trip or just a moment where you're like, God was there? Like for me, I remember when my wife and we had just had a miscarriage. We were in the midst of heartbreak, and I will never forget being at a worship service in Waco, singing the song, "You're a Good, Good Father." And in that moment, God as Father met me as we were grieving the loss of that baby that passed away. God met me. I had beyond a shadow of a doubt, God was with me. He was there. See, we have these moments in our past that we can look back and we can say, you know what, God was there. But a shift has to take place in our life where we stop saying God was there and we begin to say, God is here. Like every day of your life, you wake up and you're not trying to get back to some place that you were in your past, saying, God was there, I want to go back there. But you say, no, God is here. You prioritize His presence now. Like, let me just make a connection for you about the Ark of the Covenant. Like, I've been at Breakaway almost 5 years now, and this is my first time ever to unpack the Ark of the Covenant. How could that be if the Ark of the Covenant was so important in the Old Testament? Well, because the Ark of the Covenant isn't a thing now. Like Jesus Christ, when He was crucified on the cross, when He declared, "It is finished," do you know what happened in that moment? The Gospels tell us that the thick curtain that separated the people of Israel from the Ark of the Covenant, where the presence of God was, it says that the curtain was torn in two. Jesus Christ, through His sacrifice on the cross, He made a way for us into the presence of God. So it's no longer one priest that gets the privilege of going to meet with God. Anyone who would put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ can know God in a personal way and meet with Him. Hebrews chapter 10 puts it this way: therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way He opened for us through the curtain, that is, through His flesh. Jesus Christ died, was buried, and rose from the dead to give us access to the presence of God. The Ark of the Covenant resided in the temple of God. Now through faith in Jesus Christ, 1 Corinthians 6 says this, or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? See, we got to stop saying God was there. We got to start saying God is here. Like, prioritize His presence in your life. What does it look like for you to begin to believe God is here? He is here. Well, let me just encourage you. You want to prioritize God's presence in your life? Commit to meeting with Him every day. Did you hear what I said? Commit to meeting with God every day. Wake up and say, today I will meet with God. What I didn't say is commit to meet with His Word. You should read His Word every day. But some of us stop short and we only meet with His Word, but we don't meet with the one who gave the Word. The Word exists for us to meet with God. You don't read the Bible for connection or for completion. You read it for connection. Meet with Him. And when you read this book, ask the question, God, what do you want to say to me now? When you come to Breakaway, come to meet with God. And when you do meet with God at home, don't leave Him at home. Like, often we act like God is like a puppy that you say goodbye to Him at the door, and He kind of sits there at the door with His head tilted looking at you like, oh, why are you leaving now? I'll see you when you get home. And then we leave Him at home, and then we go and do our thing, and then we come home and He greets us back. No. When you say amen at home, just realize that the God that you just met with wants to meet with you for the rest of the day. That's why Paul says pray without ceasing, because he's like, God's going with you anyway. So when you're in your car, God's sitting shotgun. I don't know if that's theologically correct. I just know He's in your car. I don't know what seat He's in. But we should probably say He's the driver, but I don't know. It gets fuzzy. Anyway, when you're walking across campus, He's there. When you're studying, He is there. When you're eating lunch with your friends, He is there. Would you begin to believe God is here? Prioritize His presence. Number 2, tremble at God's holiness. tremble at God's holiness. I don't know if you were following along as we were reading, but this is an interesting story. Like, things go bad. Look back at what it says in verse 3. It says, "And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new car with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark." Like, when you read that they were transporting the ark on a new cart, a red flag should have gone up. A red flag should have gone up because, remember, this is the most sacred piece of furniture in all of Israel. This is the piece of furniture where God's presence is said to reside. God cares about it deeply, so God gave very specific instructions about how the Ark of the Covenant was made to be transported. Because what I didn't tell you was on each corner of this wooden box were rings, and poles were to be slid through those rings. And the Ark of the Covenant was to be transported not on a cart, but on the shoulders of Levites. Exodus 25:14 says, "And you shall put the poles into the rings on the side of the ark to carry the ark by them." In Numbers 4:15, God tells the Israelites this. He says that he's talking about the sons of Kohath. These are people who are qualified to carry the ark. It says, "But they must not touch the holy things, lest they die." These are the things of the tent of meeting that the sons of Kohath are to carry. God says, you do not touch the Ark of the Covenant. You do not touch it. It is holy. What happens? Verses 6 and 7. "And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error. He died there beside the ark of God." Let me just ask you, what's your initial reaction when you read that? Like, here's a guy helping transport the Ark of the Covenant. The oxen stumbles. The Ark of the Covenant begins to tip. And Uzzah puts out a hand to catch it. And God strikes him dead. What's your instinct? What's your response? That seems harsh, right? That seems harsh. Uzzah's just helping God out. It was tipping. He caught it. You're welcome. God kills him. Feels harsh. But that's the wrong response. That's an uninformed response. See, what our response should be is not God was harsh. Our response should be Uzzah was careless. In light of the fact that God is a holy God. See, God was clear. These are holy things. You don't touch them or you die. There's a way that my ark, my presence is to be transported. It's not on a cart, even if it is new. The Uzzah, Abinadab, Ahio, they were careless because they were dealing with a holy God. See, Uzzah was 2%ing the holiness of God. You have to remember, and I hope you don't miss what I'm telling you, your view of God determines your response to God. Like, your view of God, how you think about God will determine how you act and react to God. One of the best things you can do if you want to be white hot for Jesus, if you want to be all in for Jesus, it is to expand your view of him, and more specifically, it is to have an accurate understanding of the holiness of God. That word holy is a word that we use a lot. And a lot of times, the meaning of it is very vague. So let me just spell out what it means that God is holy. Holy is the Hebrew word kadosh. It means awesome or singled out. It means sacred. It can even mean cut off. So the idea is that God is singled out or cut off from everyone else in terms of his greatness and his awesomeness. When we talk about the holiness of God, we're talking about the otherness of God. We're talking about the fact that God is so unlike us, that he is so other than us. He is so much greater than anyone or anything that we could ever comprehend. Isaiah 55 helps us get there a little when God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts." What's he saying? You don't think like I think. No one on the planet thinks like I think. For your thoughts are not my thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. God is saying, I am so other than you. That's where we have to start with God. And when you look in the scriptures, when you look at what happens when people encounter God, when they get a vision of him and they behold his holiness, just watch their responses. Like the nation of Israel, they hear God speak audibly. They hear God speak audibly, and you know how they respond? They're like, we just beat death. They hear God speak, and they run to Moses, and they're like, Moses, you go and talk to God for us, because we don't know if we'll survive if he does it again. If he just talks to us again, we might not make it. Isaiah gets a vision of the throne room of God, and when he sees God, the seraphim are declaring, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. Do you know what Isaiah says? He says, woe is me, I am lost. I am lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. Who in your life do you have that kind of response to? Like, who in your life do you get around? You're like, whoa, I am lost. Like, I just realized I haven't even said a word before you, but I'm a foul mouth. I am filthy in front of you. Just being in your presence makes me realize I'm a filthy man. Anyone like that in your life? What about this? Ezekiel gets a vision of the throne room of God, and when he sees God, he just collapses on the ground. You have anyone in your life? They just walk through the door and you're just like you're just down. They're like, you just do that to me. Or like John in the book of Revelation gets a vision of the glorified Jesus. You know what he does? He falls on the ground. He's like, I died. This is it. I just died. And the angel's like, you're not dead. Anyone in your life like that? No. This is the holiness of God that we are talking about. Your view of God determines your response to God. I remember when I was young, I was probably in 4th or 5th grade, my dad would play racquetball once a week with one of his close friends, and I would always go along because my dad's friend would bring his son, and so we'd hang out while our dads played racquetball. And I remember we got there, and my dad had reserved the court at the YMCA, and there was 2 high school kids that were playing on the court that my dad had reserved, and they were just playing right through my dad's time for the court. So my dad just gently and nicely, he knocked on the window and just told the high school kid, hey, it's time. And the high school kid gave him the finger and flicked my dad off. And I'll never forget that high school kid came out. And what he didn't realize was that my dad at the time was the chief psychologist at the Dallas County Juvenile Department, which is the place where teenagers go who have not done right. And my dad's friend was actually a Dallas County judge, as well as an attorney. And when that high school kid came out, my dad very clearly and firmly informed that high school kid who he had just flicked off. And it put fear into that kid. And I remember that kid's friend saying, dude, you cannot do that. That high school kid didn't know who he was interacting with. And he was far too comfortable and far too casual in the presence of one who commanded his authority. And when we look into the story, the same thing happened with Uzzah. And you might look at him and be like, he's not flicking God off. Yes, he is. Because God had said, you touch it, you die. When you move it, you carry it. Uzzah, Abinadab, they say, no, we'll do it our way. We'll do it our way. And so look at David's response. His response is really interesting in verse 8. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah. Isn't that interesting? When we feel humiliated, we get mad at God. You ever feel that? Like you're the one in the wrong, yet you're mad at God like he did something wrong. But then his reaction changes quickly. Verse 9. And David was afraid of the Lord that day. He was afraid of the Lord that day. And he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? Do you see it? The holiness of God snaps him back into place. David is confronted with the holiness of God. And the holiness of God puts the fear of God back into him. You want to be all in with Jesus, then you have to remember that God is holy, holy, holy. And there's times that we can be far too casual and far too careless in his presence. See, we talk often about the love of God and the grace of God, and God is loving and God is gracious, but our tendency is to water God down. And we want to be so in with his love and grace that we water God down to just a friend or a buddy. And Jesus is friend. And God the Father is our Father. But you cannot divorce God's love and grace from his holiness. And in fact, his holiness is what informs his love and grace. You need his love and his grace because he is holy. And we are unable to stand before a holy God apart from his love and his grace. And so let me just encourage you. Tremble at the holiness of God. I know for me that there's times where I enter into my time with the Lord in the morning and I just kind of blaze in. Just kind of sit down and I just start talking. I'm like, hey God, I just start jabbering. And there's times where in a moment as I'm praying and I'm just kind of rolling, I'm like, and God, you are holy. Like as I get to the second holy, like my speech slows down. And when I hit the third holy one, I'm like, God, you are holy, holy, holy. And it resets me. And my posture goes from slumping in my chair to sitting on the edge or bending a knee. And sometimes we just need to remind ourselves, our God is holy, holy, holy. So first, I want to encourage you, prioritize God's presence. Number 2, tremble at God's holiness. Number 3, treasure God's commands. Treasure God's commands. Did you see the word I used? I used the word treasure. I didn't just say obey his commands, because his commands aren't burdensome. I said treasure them, like see the value in them. Like 1 Chronicles chapter 15 gives us another vantage point at this story. And it's giving us a vantage point at David's second go at bringing the ark. Because after Uzzah died, David was like, I can't take the ark. So he sent it to Obed-Edom for a few months. And now when David tries again, listen to what he says in verse 13. This is so important. This is so telling. He's talking to Levites, and he says, because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us because we did not seek him according to the rule. We didn't seek him according to the rule. So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, and the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders with the poles, as Moses had commanded according to the word of the Lord. You hear what David's saying? He's saying, we got too comfortable. We were far too casual. And we were far too careless. And we won't make the same mistake again. We're going to do it right, and we're going to do it exactly how God prescribed for us to do it. Charles Swindoll puts it this way. This is really good. He says, if the Lord cared enough to write it and cared enough to preserve it, he cares enough about the details to have you and me pull it off precisely his way. precisely his way. That's why you have to know his word if you're going to know his ways, so that you can carry out his will. Here's the problem. French existentialist philosopher, I don't do a lot of reading with the existentialist French philosophers, but Jean-Paul Sartre says this. Here's the problem. Man is the being whose project is to be God. You see that? He's saying man is the being whose project is to be God. That's our tendency. God has spoken. He's gone to great lengths to say, hey, this is my word. It tells you my ways so that you can carry out my will. And we're like, yeah, I've heard about your ways, and I've heard about your word, and I've heard about your will, but I want to try and carry out your will my way. How does that work? God, I want to carry out your will my way. Like one of my friends in college, he and his girlfriend, strong followers of Jesus, wanting to honor God in their relationship, but I'll never forget him telling me, we've just decided when it comes to the physical stuff, we've just decided we're good with everything above the waist. And I don't know where you stand on all physical stuff and dating relationships. Now's not that conversation. You might hear that and be like, it's not enough. But that's your deal. But I just think about his wording. We've decided. I didn't realize you had a decision to make. Because God gave you his word that spelled out his ways to live in his will. Here's the problem, and I hope you don't miss it. Our problem is that often we want God's commands to submit to our feelings. We want his commands to submit to our feelings. So we say things like this, well, I just don't feel convicted about that. Like I don't feel convicted about sleeping with my girlfriend. I just don't feel convicted about looking at porn. I just don't feel convicted about getting wasted on the weekend. You see what you're doing? You're making it your project to be God. You're saying, you know what, God's ways submit to my feelings. But see, God's commands should never submit to your feelings. Your feelings should always submit to God's commands. So if you don't feel convicted about something that God has spelled out, the issue isn't with God's commands. The issue is with your heart. The issue is with your heart. You are more than your feelings. I just want you to know, obedience to God's commands is one of the greatest ways we can show God that we love him. And Jesus, in his kindness, when he left, he sent his Spirit. The Spirit of God is God. It is God living inside of those who have put their trust in him. The Spirit of God empowers us to obey God's commands. John 14:15 says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. But not only that, not only is obedience an expression of love to God, obedience is the gateway to greater joy and freedom. Look at how the story plays out. Verse 12, follow along. And it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belonged to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who had bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal, and David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. David is like, we're obeying it. We're doing things right. So they carry the ark, and every 6 steps, David stops and just holds a worship service. So just think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Everyone stop. Get down and worship. 6 more steps, worship. Do you see it? Obedience leads to freedom and joy. They're dancing. They're celebrating. They're not sitting there carrying it and be like, God's miserable. Like his way of doing things is miserable. Obedience leads to joy and freedom. My friend Todd Wagner puts it this way. He says, God isn't trying to rip you off. He's trying to set you free. And yet we have an enemy who continually lies to us and just says, God really isn't that good, and his commands exist to weigh you down. But they exist to set you free. I was talking with one of my kids the other night. There's a kid at school that's been really mean to him multiple times. And I can tell it's really bothering my son to the point where bitterness towards that person is beginning to grow. And I know from personal experience, bitterness will overwhelm your soul like weeds. And it will kill anything healthy inside of you. And so I've talked to my son and I've just said, man, I encourage you to have a conversation with that kid and just say, look, hey, is there anything that I've done to frustrate you or offend you? Because I want us to be good. I see the way that you treat me, and I just want to make sure what is going on in our relationship. And yet I look at my son in the eyes when I'm telling this and I see fear inside of him. Because he doesn't fully trust that what I'm telling him will lead to freedom and joy. I can see it in his eyes that having to have that conversation and let go of that bitterness will actually rip him off. And I wonder if we do the same thing with God. We look at his commands. We say, God, I don't know. It feels like you're trying to take something from me. It feels like you're trying to keep me from pleasure. It feels like you're trying to keep me from joy. What if he's just trying to set you free? The last thing I encourage you to do, you want to be all in with Jesus. You prioritize his presence. You tremble at God's holiness. Number 3, you treasure his commands. And number 4, you reject man's opposition. I don't have time to read the rest of the text for you. I'll just read you verse 16. Listen to what happens. It says, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. This is David's wife. Sees David dancing and celebrating, and he comes into the house, and she basically says, you're making a fool of yourself. You are the king of Israel, and you are acting like a fool. And you know what David says? He is like, man, I'll become even more undignified than this before my God. He just rejects the opposition. You need to know, when you're all in for Jesus, it's going to rub people the wrong way, especially in the Christian bubble. People will look at your life and be convicted by your life. People don't like being convicted. So people will look at you and they'll talk about you behind your back and talk about how you're too extreme and that you're legalistic. Let's just be clear on what legalism is. Legalism is doing things in order to earn God's approval. Or legalism is ratifying certain acts, saying that if you don't do these certain acts, then you can't win God's approval. When you're all in for Jesus, a lot of times you're not being legalistic, you're just being holy. And people can't stand that. Because when they want a 2% Jesus, your life is a reminder that they're living outside of the will of God. Reject opposition. I just want to kind of finish up tonight. We're giving this talk on being all in with Jesus in the midst of a leadership series. What does this have to do with leadership? Well, did you see how the text started? David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David gathers 30,000 people. He says, this is what we're going to do. We're going to bring the presence of God into our midst. That's leadership. The good leaders are pace setters. And let me just tell you this. I know that people all over the world look at Texas A&M and they talk about how there's a unique movement of God on this campus, but I want you to know I minister on this campus. I've ministered on this campus for almost 5 years now. And this campus is still in deep need of a few men or a few women who would rise up and say, I am all in for Jesus. Desperately needs some men and women who will set the pace. So let me just encourage you to take some steps before you leave tonight. Let me just encourage you during the worship song we're about to sing, or even after the worship, sit and meet with God. Like, don't leave tonight without having met with God. And then when you get home tonight, I want to encourage you to talk with a roommate, or even as you're walking home or driving home, share with a friend what commands you want to fully obey in order to walk in freedom and display your love for God. And then every day this week, I want to encourage you to start your day on your knees, telling God you are holy, holy, holy. And if you're here tonight and you don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ, I want you to know Breakaway exists so that you would know Jesus. We talked about prioritizing the presence of God. You need to know Jesus was forsaken from the presence of God so that we could spend eternity in the presence of God. When Jesus hung on the cross, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was forsaken from the presence of God so that when you put your faith in Jesus Christ, you would be invited into his presence now and for all of eternity. We talked about trembling at God's holiness. Jesus was and is holy, and he came to earth so that we who are unholy could be made right with a holy God. You cannot be right with God apart from the work of Jesus, who himself is holy. We talked about treasuring God's commands. Jesus perfectly obeyed God's commands to redeem us who never could. You will never be enough for God. And that's okay because Jesus has been enough for you. And yet when you put your faith in Jesus Christ, he puts his Spirit inside of you, empowering you to live a life that is pleasing to him. And then we talked about rejecting man's opposition. Jesus endured opposition from man so that we could enjoy acceptance by God. If you don't know Jesus, the invitation is on the table for you tonight to come and to know him as your Savior, and that you'd begin to live with him as your King.